She had walked into the crowded hall that evening with no idea of what awaited her. The air inside was thick with voices, laughter, and whispers, as if the whole building itself was alive and feeding on the excitement of the people packed within. The sound of chairs scraping the floor mixed with the echo of boots stamping against the tiles. Every eye seemed fixed on her as she stepped forward. The faint creak of the door closing behind her cut through the noise, leaving a strange sense that she had just sealed herself inside with something far darker than she imagined. She kept her posture straight, her head high, her shoulders squared every step, measured and deliberate. She did not show fear nor hesitation, though inside her chest, her heart was pounding against her ribs in a steady rhythm like a war drum. The crowd began to shift as she moved deeper into the hall, men and women forming a loose circle around her, their smirks sharp, their eyes gleaming with something cruel, something. Eager like hunters who had cornered prey that could no longer run the heat of their gaze pressed against her like fire. But she did not flinch. The first laugh rose from the left side of the hall, a high, harsh sound that cut through the murmurs like a blade. Others followed, and soon the hall was filled with mocking voices, each word dripping with venom. She heard names shouted at her, names meant to wound, names meant to break her down. She felt the weight of their judgment pressing on her skin, yet her eyes remained steady and unshaken. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing weakness. The group at the center stepped closer, bold enough to stand face to face with her. Their leader, tall, broad-shouldered, his smirk wide and arrogant. His hand raised to silence the noise around him as if he was the ruler of this hall. He circled her slowly, his boots striking the ground with deliberate weight, his eyes scanning her from head to toe with the same coldness a wolf shows before it. Pounces. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel his breath heavy and taunting, his voice low, but loud enough for everyone to hear as he questioned her presence in the hall. She answered nothing. Her silence was her weapon. Her stillness unnerved some of the people on the edges, but the leader only grinned wider as if her refusal to speak was weakness. He turned to the crowd and mocked her, daring her to prove herself, daring her to show that she belonged here. The others cheered, encouraged him. Emboldened by his confidence, their laughter filled the walls, bouncing back like an echo of cruelty, growing louder until it seemed to suffocate. The air hands reached forward, grabbing at her arms, at her jacket, pulling with force. She resisted at first, not moving her stance, but their numbers overwhelmed her, as cloth tore under rough fingers. The sound of fabric ripping filled the air like a scream. The crowd erupted louder, more savage as the pieces fell to the ground. She stood still, unyielding, though they stripped layer by layer, the cold air of the hall brushing against her skin as her dignity was torn away. Yet even as she was left exposed, she never bowed her head, never let them see defeat in her eyes. Each face in the crowd was alight with hunger for more, yet beneath their cruel excitement, there was something else, something unspoken that lingered in the silence between their shouts. They wanted her to break, to fall, to beg, but she gave them nothing. She kept her gaze fixed, not on them, but beyond them, as if she were waiting for something greater, something inevitable. Her calmness unsettled a few in the back. They whispered among themselves, unsure why she did not fight, why she did not cry, why she did not collapse like they expected. The leader laughed again, louder than before, enjoying the spectacle. He reached forward, his hand rough and unkind, tearing away the last barrier that covered her chest. The room erupted into sudden silence as, if the very walls had stolen away their voices, they had expected shame, humiliation, weakness. But instead their eyes caught the glint of something golden, something sharp and unmistakable. A symbol burned into the fabric of her being. For a moment, no one breathed, no one spoke. The trident gleamed faintly under the harsh lights overhead, and though none of them reached for it, all of them felt the weight of it pressing on their chests, pressing into their lungs, choking the laughter that had filled the air just moments before the insignia that marked her was not decoration. It was history. It was blood, sweat, and sacrifice. It was the seal of warriors who had endured storms, fire, and death and had emerged unbroken. The whispers began again, but this time they carried no mockery, only fear, confusion, disbelief. The stories they had heard of those who bore that trident returned to their minds, tales of missions no one else could survive, of battles fought in darkness, of victories carved. Through impossible odds, the hall no longer felt like theirs. It felt like a battlefield, and she was no longer prey but something far more dangerous. Yet she remained still silent, her eyes locked on the leader who had torn her dignity away. His smirk had vanished, his face pale, his confidence crumbling under the realization of what he had uncovered. His hand trembled ever so slightly, but he did not dare move away. The crowd looked to him, waiting for what he would do, waiting for what she would do, the tension heavy enough to shatter the air. She stood like stone, like a storm not yet unleashed, her silence louder than any words, her presence heavier than any threat. Every second stretched long, unbearable. The leader took a half step back, his boots scraping the floor louder than before. The circle around her loosened ever so slightly, fear creeping into their eyes, though none would admit it. None could deny what they had just seen. And still, she did not move. Still, she held her ground, waiting. For the perfect moment, waiting for them to realize that they had not broken her, that they had awakened something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. And the room trembled with the weight of what was coming next. The hall had fallen into an uneasy silence after the golden trident was revealed. Yet silence did not mean peace. It was the kind of silence that trembled before the roar of a storm, the kind that made every breath heavy and every glance sharp. The group that had surrounded her moments ago hesitated, their laughter stolen, their courage cracked. But hesitation was not enough to erase the cruelty they had begun. With hands still gripped her arms, pulling, tugging, as if they could finish what they had started, as if exposing. Her strength would somehow make her weaker, when in truth it only made her far more terrifying. The leader swallowed hard, his voice caught in his throat, yet pride kept him from stepping back. He forced himself to smirk again, though it was nothing more than a mask covering fear. He dared to raise his hand to her shoulder, gripping her as if to prove that he still had control, but she did not resist. She let him believe for one fragile moment that he still held power over her, though deep within her calm there was a fire rising, a fire that could burn through the arrogance of every person in that room. The crowd began to whisper louder, now their voices clashing with one another, confusion spreading faster than the earlier laughter. Some claimed it was impossible that she could not be what the trident said she was. Others argued that the insignia was undeniable, forged in the crucible of the hardest training known to man. Still there were those who urged the leader to continue to show her that symbols meant nothing if she stood alone, but their words carried less conviction than before, their courage dripping away like water slipping through their fingers. Hands tore again at the remnants of her clothing, as if they were desperate to prove her humanity, to strip her of the aura she now carried. Yet with each shred of fabric that fell to the ground, their own confidence seemed to unravel. She stood tall, unflinching. Every piece they ripped away revealed not weakness, but strength. The kind of strength etched into her body through years of battle, scars unseen and endurance carved into every muscle and every breath. The leader pressed closer, his voice breaking through the rising panic in the room. He mocked her again, trying to convince himself more than the others that she was nothing but a fraud, that a trident could not save her. Now that here in this hall among these people she was powerless, but his words rang hollow. They fell into the silence like stones into the ocean, sinking quickly, vanishing without impact. She did not even glance at him. She let his bravado echo until it turned against him, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. One of the younger men from the crowd dared to step forward. Emboldened by the leader's crumbling pride, he reached toward her as if to push her down to the floor to make her kneel before them. But the moment his hand came close, her eyes snapped to him, cold, sharp, and merciless. The air itself seemed to freeze around him. His hand stopped mid-air, trembling, as if his body refused to obey the cruelty his mind demanded. He stumbled back, shaken by nothing more than her gaze, and the crowd murmured again, fear spreading through them like wildfire. Still she did not move. Still she let them tear and mock. Still she endured in silence, for her silence was not weakness. It was the sound of judgment, waiting. It was the breath before the strike. It was the calm before the inevitable storm. She held her power tightly within, her chest letting it build, letting them believe they had won, only to feel the crushing weight of realization when they understood the truth too late. The leader clenched his fists. Frustrated by the shift in the air, he could feel the crowd slipping. From his control, he could see the fear creeping into their faces, and he knew that if he did not act now, he would lose everything. He snarled, and with a sudden burst of force, he shoved her hard, his intent clear to throw. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some took steps back, unable to comprehend how she stood unbroken. After such force, the leader himself faltered, staring at her with eyes wide. His smirk, gone completely, now replaced with something far more human fear, raw and undeniable. Yet he could not retreat, for retreat would mean admitting defeat in front of them all. He raised his hand again, preparing for another strike, but before he could move, her head tilted slightly, her eyes locked on his. Every ounce of silence heavier than a shout. Every ounce of stillness heavier than a blow. The tension in the room thickened, unbearable each second, stretching longer than the last. The crowd pressed tighter around the circle, yet none dared to reach out again. None dared to laugh. None dared to breathe too loudly. The leader froze, his hand suspended in the air, his body betraying him with hesitation. And in that hesitation, the weight of the trident gleamed brighter, heavier in their minds than in reality. She had not moved, she had not struck, and yet she had already taken control of the hall. The whispers now turned into urgent murmurs, panic laced through every word. Some urged retreat, others urged action, but no one knew what to do. They were trapped. Between the fear of her and the fear of each other, the leader looked around at the eyes of his followers, seeing doubt where once there had been loyalty. Their fear infected him, making his own pride wobble. Yet still he refused to yield. He clenched, his teeth, his jaw tight as he stepped closer, ready to prove himself through force. But the closer he came, the more his steps slowed, as if gravity itself had turned against him. She remained still, her eyes unblinking her body, unmoving her silence. A wall stronger than steel, and as he stood before her, hand raised yet unable to strike, the crowd realized in one crushing wave of truth that the humiliation they had tried to force upon her had turned back on them the trap they thought they had. Set had become their prison, and the warrior before them had not even begun to show her power. The hall was trembling with suspense. The leader trapped in his own hesitation, the crowd suffocating under fear, and she standing tall, waiting for the moment when their arrogance would collapse completely, waiting for the moment when the storm she carried within her would break loose and change everything forever. The silence in the hall had grown so heavy that it pressed into the skin of everyone who stood within it, and still. She did not move, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Her eyes locked on the circle of faces around her, the trident glinting faintly under the light, like a beacon of something none of them were. Prepared to face the golden insignia burned into their minds, sharper than any blade, and the weight of its meaning settled like chains across their shoulders. They stared, unable to look away, each one of them caught in the grip of disbelief. The stories they had heard of those who bore that mark came flooding back. Tales told in hushed voices around campfires or whispered in bars late at night, missions across seas, deserts, and jungles where only ghosts returned, and yet here stood a woman they had mocked, stripped, humiliated, and she bore the very symbol that separated warriors from ordinary men. The leader himself felt his throat tighten, though he tried to mask it with another forced grin. The crowd shifted their boots, scuffing the floor. As unease slithered through them, their earlier cruelty evaporated like mist under fire. Each second stretched longer, the silence screaming louder than their earlier jeers. Some whispered that it had to be fake, that it was impossible for someone like her to wear the trident. Yet even as they tried to convince themselves, their voices wavered, their eyes betrayed doubt and fear. No counterfeit could carry the weight of presence that now filled the hall. She finally lifted her head, her chin angled slightly upward, and though her lips did not part, her gaze spoke louder than words. Her eyes were not those of someone broken or humiliated. They were the eyes of someone forged in storms, someone who had seen darkness and walked through it. Someone who had survived trials that none in the room could imagine. Her stillness was not silence, it was judgment, and the crowd felt it pressing into them like an invisible hand. The leader took a step back, his boots scraping loudly across the tiles, the sound echoing like a confession of weakness. His pride burned, but his fear burned hotter. He opened his mouth to speak, to reclaim his control. Yet no words came out. His throat dry, his confidence gone. The eyes of his followers were on him, now waiting, demanding he lead. But he had nothing to offer, no courage, no strength. He had tried to break her, but instead it was his own spirit that cracked. One of the men from the crowd tried to laugh to cut through the suffocating silence, but the sound faltered halfway, choking into a cough. It died quickly. No one dared join in. No one dared mock her anymore. The trident gleamed again in the light, each reflection stabbing into their thoughts, each gleam a reminder that they had awakened something. Beyond them, she had not lifted a hand, she had not spoken a word yet, she was already winning the battle. Then slowly, deliberately, she took a step forward, her boot striking the ground with measured force. The sound carried across the hall sharper than thunder. It was not loud, but it was final. It was the kind of sound that ended arguments, that silenced doubts. The crowd instinctively stepped back, forming a wider circle, their fear pushing them away from her presence, and in that moment, it was clear that she had taken control of the space. She was no longer cornered. She was the one driving them back. Her eyes scanned the faces before her, moving from one trembling figure to the next, her silence cutting deeper than any insult she let them see the steadiness of her breath, the unwavering strength in her posture, the fire hidden just beneath her calm. Each one who met her gaze flinched, turning their eyes downward, unable to withstand the storm contained in her stare, the humiliation they had forced upon her had twisted into their own chains, binding them in shame. The leader struggled to stand his ground, but his body betrayed him. His fists clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling too quickly, his face pale under the harsh lights. He wanted to bark an order to command the others to act, yet none of them would move. None dared to step closer, not when her silence hung in the air like the edge of a blade. He was alone, and though he stood taller than her, he felt small as a shadow under her presence. Still she did not rush. Still she did not strike. Her control was absolute, built on patience, built on the discipline of one who had been trained to outlast storms. Her silence stretched further, suffocating them, crushing their courage, and the longer it lasted, the more they broke one by one. She saw it in their faces, in their trembling hands, in the way they shifted their weight, uncertain of whether to flee or bow. She had turned the hall into a battlefield, without lifting a weapon. The whispers turned to arguments, some urging retreat, others demanding they act now before it was too late. But no one moved, their words hollow without conviction. The leader raised his hand again, desperate to command them. But his voice cracked when he tried to speak, and the sound of weakness spread through the hall faster than fire. His authority slipped from his grasp, falling into the silence she had built, and there was nothing he could do to take it back. Another step forward. Her boots, steady, her eyes fixed on him. She did not need to say his name. He knew she was speaking to him without words. His heart pounded so hard it hurt his chest. He could feel sweat trailing down his neck, though the air was cool. His pride urged him to stand tall, but fear forced his knees to bend ever so slightly, and the crowd saw it. They saw the crack in their leader, and with that, the last thread of their courage unraveled. Her presence was crushing, now filling every corner of the hall. The trident shining like fire on her chest, the crowd frozen in the storm of silence and fear. Each second stretched longer, each breath louder, each glance heavier. She was not humiliated, she was not broken, she was everything they had tried to deny and far more powerful than they had ever imagined. And still she had not yet made her move, leaving them to drown in the terror of what might come next. The leader stood trembling in the center of the hall, though he tried to mask his fear behind clenched fists and a false smirk. Yet the truth showed in the sweat rolling down his face and the way his eyes darted from side to side. His arrogance was crumbling, his strength failing. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, each voice carrying unease as they realized the shift in power that had swept through the room. The trident on her chest seemed to glow brighter, with every passing second its presence more commanding than any weapon. She stepped forward again, each footfall slow and deliberate, her boots striking the ground with the weight of inevitability. The sound echoed in the silence, making the walls themselves seem to tremble. The crowd instinctively moved back, opening space, as if the very air around her demanded distance. Their mocking laughter had vanished, their jeers replaced with wide eyes and dry throats. She had endured their cruelty without a word, and now every ounce of that patience was turning into something far more dangerous. Her eyes fixed on the leader, unblinking, sharp, relentless. He tried to hold her gaze, but his resolve cracked. His body shifted back half a step before he forced himself still. Though the fear in his face betrayed him, he raised his chin, trying to summon authority. He no longer had his voice shook as he barked an order to his men to seize her, to hold her down, to finish what they had started. But none of them moved. Not a single one dared to approach her now. Their courage dissolved into ash. The silence that followed his command was louder than any refusal. His authority shattered in front of them all. The leader turned red with rage and humiliation. He shouted again, his words harsher, sharper, but still no one obeyed. The trident had already stripped him of his power without her needing to lift a hand. She watched him calmly, her posture unshaken, her expression carved in stone. She allowed the silence to stretch, suffocating him, drowning him in his own failure. The crowd murmured, now voices carrying fear more than defiance. Some whispered that they should leave before it was too late. Others whispered that staying might seal their fate, but no one dared move first, their eyes flicking from her to the leader, waiting to see which one would make the next move. She let them wait. She let them feel the unbearable pressure of stillness, the weight of knowing they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The leader clenched his fists tighter, his pride refusing to break. Even as his men faltered, he lunged forward, suddenly desperate to reclaim control. His hand shot out toward her shoulder as if grabbing her would prove his strength. But she did not flinch. She let him come close, his hand barely touching her. When her gaze locked on him, fully sharp and merciless, the force of it stopped him mid-motion as though he had slammed into an invisible wall. His breath caught, his confidence gone. The trident gleamed brighter between them. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd as they watched their leader falter so easily, their faith in him evaporating before their eyes. They had once cheered his arrogance. Now they saw only weakness exposed under the weight of her silence. She took another step forward, closing the distance between them, her shadow stretching across the floor, swallowing his. His body froze. His hand dropped powerless at his side, the air thick around them, pressing down heavier than stone. The hall was no longer his. It belonged to her. Now every person there felt it in their bones, the shift of power undeniable. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to strike. She simply stood her strength, undeniable, her presence commanding, and the leader who once believed he controlled the room now looked like nothing more than prey cornered by a predator he could not understand. Some of the men in the crowd tried to muster courage, urging him to act, urging him to show that he was still in control. But their words faltered. As she turned her gaze toward them one by one, each of them lowered their heads, unable to meet her eyes, unable to withstand the storm that burned within her. Silence, her strength was not in motion, but in restraint. Every second she held back, made her power grow heavier over them all. The leader swallowed hard, his throat dry. He tried to raise his voice again, but it cracked, betraying his fear. His men shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty breaking their trust in him, shattered by his weakness. She saw it all in their faces, the collapse of their courage, the death of their arrogance, and she knew she had already won the battle. Though she had not yet raised a single hand, her silence was their defeat. Another step forward, her boots clicking, against the floor like the toll of a bell announcing the inevitable, her eyes locked on the leader who now trembled. Though he tried to hide it, the crowd felt the storm pressing closer, her presence swallowing the space around them. No one dared laugh, no one dared jeer. The cruelty that once filled the room, now replaced by terror and uncertainty. She was no longer the woman they had stripped. She was the warrior they had awakened, and she was not finished yet. The leader stumbled back, his pride breaking under the weight of her approach, his voice caught in his throat, his eyes wide as if staring at something far greater than himself. His men looked on helpless, their fear chaining them to the floor. None of them dared to step forward. None dared to reach for her. And with every moment, their silence betrayed them, their power gone, their control lost. Still she had not spoken. Still, she had not struck. She let the fear grow. She let their imagination torture them with the question of what she might do next. She let them drown in the suspense, the leader trapped in the cage of his own arrogance, the crowd trapped in the prison of their own cruelty. And she standing tall, her presence commanding the hall, her silence louder than thunder and heavier than stone, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal what would come next. The weight of the silence in the hall had become unbearable, and still she had not spoken. Her voice held back as if waiting for the exact moment when words would strike sharper than any weapon. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their bodies tense, their eyes darting between her and the leader, whose face had lost all its former arrogance, his breath quick, his fists trembling at his sides, though he tried to hide it. His strength was gone, his authority broken, and yet pride kept him standing, though every instinct screamed at him to flee. At last, she let her voice cut through the silence, steady, calm, but carrying a power that wrapped around every soul. In the room, her words rolled out with measured force, reminding them that respect is not given through cruelty nor taken through humiliation, but earned through sacrifice, through struggle, through a strength forged where others would break. Each syllable fell heavy into the air, and the crowd listened, unable to turn away, unable to resist the weight of her truth. Her voice was not loud, yet it carried farther than any shout. It pierced through the tension sharper than the echo of boots, sharper than the tearing of fabric. It carried the weight of oceans and storms, the weight of training endured in silence, the weight of scars that no one else in the room could imagine. Those who had mocked her now lowered their eyes, the shame on their faces undeniable. Her words had stripped them bare more completely than they had tried to strip her. But she was not finished. She lifted her chin, her eyes narrowing as she asked them a single question, her tone colder than steel. "Do you understand?" What you have done. The question froze the hall. Every head turned, every chest tightened as if chains had been thrown over them. Some tried to look away, but her eyes held them pinned. Her voice echoing in their minds, forcing them to confront the truth of their cruelty, the truth that they had mocked and humiliated someone far beyond their reach. The leader tried to laugh, his voice shaking, breaking into the air, but it carried no conviction. His laughter died after a single breath. His men saw his weakness, his power crumbling faster than sand in the tide. He tried to speak to answer her question, but no words came. His mouth dry, his chest heaving. He looked at her and saw not the woman he had tried to humiliate, but the warrior. The storm, the embodiment of everything he feared. She did not let the silence linger this time. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately reaching toward her side. The crowd stiffened, eyes widening, breaths caught in their throats as the faint glint of steel. Appeared a blade, small, yet sharp, drawn not with speed but with precision, the kind of precision that spoke of discipline, of training, of control. Her grip firm, steady the weapon, a part of her not carried for intimidation, but as a reminder of what she was capable of. Gasps rippled through the hall as the light caught on the blade. Every person there frozen in place, none dared to move. None dared to breathe. They did not know whether she meant to strike or simply show them the reality of the warrior. They had provoked their fear filled the air thicker than smoke, their imagination painting 1,000 outcomes, all ending with their defeat. Her presence alone already more than they could endure. She let the blade rest at her side, her arm, steady her gaze sweeping across the crowd, each face pale, each body trembling. The weapon was not pointed at them, yet they felt it pressed against their throats. The strength of her silence sharper than any cut. She had no need to strike. She had no need to threaten. The blade was not her power. It was the reminder that her power had always been far greater than theirs. The leader took a step back, his body betraying him. His men watching with eyes wide as their trust in him dissolved. He had no answer, no command left. His pride shattered, his strength useless. He had tried to make her bow, and instead it was he who bent under the weight of her presence, his knees trembling, his chest tight with fear. The room had turned against him, and there was no escape. She spoke again, her voice low, yet carrying the power of 1,000 storms. She told them that strength was not in numbers nor in cruelty, but in discipline, in sacrifice, in the courage to stand alone when others fall. Her words were a blade sharper than the steel in her hand, cutting through the lies they had told themselves, the lies that made them believe they were powerful. Her truth crushed them, leaving them gasping in the silence of their own weakness. The hall seemed smaller now, the walls pressing closer, the air heavier. Her shadow stretched long across the floor, touching the boots of those who dared not move. The leader lowered his eyes, unable to withstand her gaze. The trident on her chest gleamed brighter than ever. A symbol of battle survived. Of storms endured, a reminder that she was more than they could ever hope to be, and they knew it now, with every beat of their trembling hearts. Still she had not raised her blade. Still she had not struck. The suspense clawed at them, ripping through their minds as they wondered what she would do next. Would she punish them? Would she forgive them? Would she leave them to choke on their shame? The not knowing was worse than any wound, worse than any blow. Her silence was the battlefield. Her words, the weapons, her presence, the storm, and they were trapped within it, powerless to escape. She shifted her weight slightly, the blade catching the light again, her eyes narrowing as she looked across the crowd. The lead. Breath caught, his knees buckled, and though he fought to remain standing, he stumbled back, the sound of his boots scraping the floor. A confession of defeat. The crowd saw it. They saw the fall of the man they had followed, the collapse of his pride. And with that, they knew it was over. But she was not finished. Not yet. Her voice came again, steady, unyielding, asking them once more if they understood what they had done, asking them if they understood the line they had crossed. Her words heavier than stone, pressing into their chests until they felt they could not breathe, and still she held the blade steady at her side, her strength unbroken, her control absolute, leaving them in torment as they waited for what would come next. The silence in the hall grew heavier with every passing second, her blade gleaming faintly at her side, her chest rising slowly with the calm of someone who knew she held complete control. The crowd stood frozen, their eyes wide, their throats tight, as if even breathing too loud would invite her wrath. She did not rush. She did not need to rush. Every heartbeat from those who had mocked her was already quickening, drowning them in their own fear. The leader tried to speak again, his lips parting, but no sound. Came his tongue dry. His courage gone, he could feel the weight of her stare pressing into his chest until he thought his ribs might break. He clenched his fists to appear strong, but his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly. His men saw it clearly, their respect fading into doubt, their fear of her stronger than any loyalty they once gave him. He was crumbling, and she had not even taken a step closer. Her voice cut through the silence, steady and sharp, reminding them that strength was not won through cruelty or numbers, but forged in storms that would have broken them long ago. Her words carried the weight of truth, each syllable like a hammer striking the foundation of their arrogance. The men shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her, eyes their pride shattering beneath the force of her calm. She lifted the blade just enough to catch the light again, not pointing it, not threatening, just reminding them that her strength was real. The glint of steel enough to send a shiver through the hall. The suspense unbearable, their imaginations running wild, each one seeing their own end. If she chose to act, yet still she did not strike. She only let the silence grow heavier, the tension twisting inside their minds like a tightening rope. The leader took a step back, his boots scraping the floor, the sound echoing like thunder in the silence. His men glanced at each other, waiting for someone to act, but no one moved. No one dared. They knew what the trident meant. They knew what she was, and none of them had the courage to stand against it. His voice finally broke free, stammering empty words, telling them not to be afraid, telling them she was only one woman. But his words carried no weight, and they all knew it. She stepped forward, slowly, her eyes never leaving his, her presence stretching across the hall, swallowing them whole with each movement, her silence louder than any threat, her control absolute. The crowd held its breath, the suspense cutting through them sharper than any blade, and they realized at last that she did not need to strike to defeat them. She had already won by making them fear what she might do next. The hall was no longer theirs. It belonged to her and to the silence that she carried like a weapon. The air was heavy, pressing down on every chest, making every breath feel like an effort. Her trident gleamed faintly in the dim light, her blade resting at her side, her eyes unwavering. She had not struck yet, but the fear of what she might do next was worse than any wound could be. The men who had once mocked her were now broken by their own fear, each of them realizing too late that they had awakened something they could not contain. She moved forward slowly, each step echoing across the tiles. Like thunder rolling in a storm, the leader stumbled back, trying to hide his trembling, but his body betrayed him, his shoulders slumping, his knees shaking. His men looked at him, no longer seeing strength in him, only weakness. He had stripped her to expose her. Yet it was he who stood exposed, now stripped of pride, stripped of command, stripped of the illusion that he held power. Her silence carved into him more deeply than any blade could. Her voice came at last, low and steady, with a force that made the walls seem to shiver. She reminded them that respect was not won through cruelty, nor was strength built by numbers. Her words spoke of storms endured, of battles survived when others would have broken, of sacrifices that forged something unbreakable. Her tone was not raised yet. Every word struck them like a hammer, heavy with truth. The men who had once laughed at her could not raise their eyes to her face, the shame pulling their heads down as if gravity itself had turned against them. The leader tried to speak, but his words stumbled from his lips, weak and broken. He told them not to fear her, told them she was only one woman, but the sound of his voice was empty, hollow. His men knew the truth. They had seen the Trident. They had felt her presence, and they would not move for him, not against her. The silence of their disobedience crushed him harder than her stare ever could. His authority dissolved before his eyes. She raised the blade slightly, just enough for the steel to catch the light, a thin glint of fire cutting through the air. The crowd stiffened, their breath caught in their throats, every eye fixed on the weapon. But she did not raise it to strike. She let it fall again to her side, her control steady her, patience sharper than the blade itself. The suspense grew heavier, their minds filled with dread of what she might choose to do, and in that dread they were already defeated. Another step forward, and the leader broke his knees, bending, his voice cracking. As he begged, words spilling out, desperate, incoherent, he asked for forgiveness. He asked for mercy. But even he could hear the hollowness in his plea. His men turned away from him, unable to watch their leader crumble into dust. She did not answer. Him not yet. She let him drown in his own fear. She let his weakness burn him more than any punishment could have done. The hall was frozen in that moment. Every man waiting for her final choice. Her shadow stretched across the floor, long and heavy. Her trident glowing like fire in their eyes, the silence stretched on unbroken, each second adding weight until it crushed them completely. She did not need to strike. She had already won. Their fear was the victory, their shame, the punishment. She could leave now, or she could end them here, and none would dare to stop her. She turned her gaze across them one last time, sharp and steady, and they lowered their eyes, all of them beaten without a fight. Her words had told them who she was. Her silence had shown them what she was, and her presence had reminded them of what true strength looked like. She stood in that hall not as their victim, but as their conqueror, and her next move remained hidden, leaving them in a fear that would never leave them even after she was gone.